Thomas Miller had always lived a life that most people would call ordinary, even predictable. At 58 years old, he carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from decades of honest work and unshakable routine. Every morning, he rose before dawn, brewed his coffee, and left for the steel plant where he had worked for nearly 35 years. His coworkers knew him as dependable, a man who never complained, who never cut corners, and who always volunteered for the extra shifts nobody wanted. In their small Midwestern town, Thomas was respected, though he never sought attention. He wore the same work boots until the soles gave out, drove a pickup with more rust than paint, and believed in saving for tomorrow rather than spending on today. He found comfort in the little things: a well-cooked meal, Sunday service at the modest brick church down the road, and evenings sitting on the porch with his wife, Linda. Linda, 2 years younger than Thomas, had once been known for her sharp mind and striking looks. She had worked as a bookkeeper at a local firm before stepping away early, saying she wanted to enjoy life while she still had the energy. But in truth, Linda often felt restless. Where Thomas saw stability, she saw stagnation. Where Thomas found peace in routine, she felt trapped by monotony. She envied the women she saw in magazines or on television. Women traveling to tropical beaches, wearing expensive jewelry, and sipping wine in glittering city restaurants. Her own life, in her eyes, had shrunk to coupon clipping and small-town gossip. She loved Thomas, or at least she once did, but over the years her affection was worn thin by the constant reminder that theirs was a life of limitation, not abundance. On the surface, they were the kind of couple neighbors looked up to, married more than 3 decades, raised 2 children who had gone on to build their own families, and still lived in the old clapboard house where they'd first started out together. But behind closed doors, their conversations were growing sharper, their silences heavier. One autumn evening, as the wind rattled the dry leaves across their porch, Thomas leaned back in his chair with a contented sigh. "Linda," he said softly, "we've done all right, haven't we? The kids are grown, the house is almost paid off. I think we can finally breathe a little." Linda, standing by the screen door with her arms crossed, gave a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Breathe," she repeated. "Thomas, we're barely scraping by. You call that breathing?" He chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "We've got enough, honey. More than enough. We don't need fancy trips or new cars. We've got what matters." But Linda's gaze was fixed far beyond the creaking porch and fading lawn. "What matters," she said, her voice low, "is living a life worth remembering, not just surviving day after day like this." Thomas frowned, hurt flickering in his tired eyes. He had given her everything he could, his loyalty, his wages, his best years. But somehow, it was never enough. The tension between them wasn't explosive, it was quieter, more insidious. Little remarks at dinner, sharp sighs when bills were opened, the way Linda lingered on television commercials showing dream vacations. These things built up like rust on metal, slow, unnoticed, until one day the whole structure gave way. Yet Thomas remained blind to the depth of her dissatisfaction. He carried on as he always had, convinced that the life they shared was steady, if not glamorous. He still believed that love meant enduring, not demanding. He still thought Linda would grow to appreciate their simple blessings in time. But Linda's mind was wandering into darker places. She found herself asking questions she never would have dared years before. Why should I grow old counting pennies while others live like queens? Why should I wait for Thomas to change when I could change everything myself? That fall, the Millers' life looked, from the outside, as calm as ever. Their children came home for Thanksgiving. Neighbors waved from across the fence, and Thomas still drove off every morning to the factory with a thermos of black coffee in hand. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Linda no longer looked at her husband with the warmth of shared years, but with a cold calculation she kept carefully hidden. She smiled when others were watching, nodded at his jokes, kissed him goodnight. But in the quiet hours, she stared into the darkness, restless and unsatisfied, wondering what it would take to finally feel free. She did not know it yet, or perhaps she did and simply refused to admit it to herself, but the seeds of betrayal had already been sown. The life Thomas believed was ordinary and safe was about to twist into something neither of them could have imagined. And when fate delivered a golden ticket, a single slip of paper worth nearly $1 million, those hidden seeds would burst open, and the love that had once bound them would unravel into greed, deception, and murder. The first snow of December had just started to dust the streets when Thomas Miller stopped at the corner convenience store after his shift. He was bone-tired, shoulders stiff from years of labor, but something that night tugged at him. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crumpled bill, and bought a lottery ticket. It wasn't something he did often. Most weeks, he considered it a waste. But this time, he smiled to himself. Why not, he muttered. Maybe lightning strikes once. The following evening, sitting in his worn recliner with the evening news flickering across the television, Thomas fumbled for the ticket. He read the numbers aloud, one by one, comparing them to the drawing. His heart began to pound. The last number matched. His hands trembled, his breath caught. He read them again, then again, as if his tired eyes were deceiving him. "Linda," he shouted, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Linda, come here." She rushed in from the kitchen, annoyed at the sharpness in his tone. "What is it now, Thomas? You sound like you've seen a ghost." He held up the slip of paper as if it were a holy relic. "We won, Linda. We won the lottery, $900,000. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Linda's eyes widened, her mouth dropped open. Then she laughed, a sound edged with something Thomas had never quite heard in her before. She snatched the ticket from his hand, staring at it as though it might dissolve into smoke if she blinked. "Are you sure? Let me see. Let me see those numbers." "It's real," Thomas whispered, still in shock. 900,000. Can you believe it? Linda pressed the ticket to her chest, her breath quickening. In that instant, she saw their lives transform. The shabby furniture replaced with gleaming leather, the old house traded for a modern one with glass windows and polished floors, her closet filled with dresses she'd only admired from afar. Thomas, however, saw something else entirely. He saw the mortgage finally paid off, the chance to help their son clear his student loans, the possibility of donating to the church that had carried them through so many hardships. To him, the money was a blessing, a way to lighten burdens, not a doorway to extravagance. They sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the ticket lying between them like a fragile treasure. Thomas spoke softly, reverently. "We'll be careful. We'll pay the debts, set something aside for the kids. Maybe fix the roof and put a little away for retirement. That's all I need, Linda. Just security." But Linda's eyes were alight with restless fire. "Security? Thomas, this is our chance to finally live. We can travel. We can buy a new house, new cars. We can have the life we deserve. Don't you see? This changes everything." Thomas shook his head, a weary smile tugging at his lips. "We don't need everything, Linda. Enough is enough." Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of frustration. "You're always thinking small, always satisfied with scraps. 900,000 isn't just enough, Thomas, it's freedom." He reached across the table, taking her hand, his calloused fingers rough against her soft skin. "Linda, freedom isn't in money. It's in peace. It's in knowing we've done right by each other, by our family. That's what matters." She pulled her hand away, her gaze drifting toward the dark window. "Maybe for you," she murmured, "but not for me." That night, while Thomas slept soundly, Linda lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The number, 900,000, echoed in her mind, pulsing like a heartbeat. She thought of the trips she'd never taken, the luxuries she'd denied herself, the envy that had burned inside her for years. She thought of how Thomas would fritter it away on debts, on the church, on their grown children. And what would be left for me? She asked herself bitterly. Over the following weeks, News of their fortune spread quietly through the town. Friends congratulated them. Neighbors offered smiles tinged with envy. Thomas took it in stride, insisting they keep a low profile. He deposited the winnings carefully, consulted a financial advisor, and spoke constantly of moderation. But Linda began to change. She bought new clothes, expensive jewelry, and spoke of vacations to Europe. At dinner, she circled glossy brochures of luxury homes in red ink, sliding them across the table. Thomas would push them back, firm but gentle. "Not yet, Linda. We have to be wise." Her patience grew thinner each day. She saw Thomas not as a partner, but as a wall standing between her and the life she craved. The money was theirs on paper, but in her heart, it already belonged to her alone. One evening, their argument boiled over. Thomas had just finished balancing their accounts, carefully setting aside portions for long-term savings. Linda slammed her hand on the table, rattling the glasses. "Enough of this, Thomas. You're suffocating me with your rules. This money isn't meant to rot in a bank account. It's meant to be spent, to change our lives." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Our lives don't need changing, Linda. What we have is good. Chasing more will only destroy us." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. For Thomas, they were meant as wisdom. For Linda, they were chains tightening around her dreams. That night, she stood at the bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. Her eyes, once full of longing, now gleamed with calculation. She whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "If Thomas won't let me have it, then maybe Thomas is the problem." The following weekend, their daughter Rachel drove in from Indianapolis with her 2 young children. She hadn't seen her parents since the lottery win and was curious about how life had changed. The moment she walked through the door, she could sense the tension lingering in the air. Thomas's face brightened at the sight of his grandkids. He lifted the youngest into his arms, spinning her around until her giggles filled the room. "See, Linda," he said with a tired smile. "This is what the money's really for, to help them, to make their future brighter." But Linda's smile was stiff. She set a tray of coffee cups down a little too hard and said, "Or maybe it's for us, Thomas. Don't forget, we worked for decades too. Don't we deserve to enjoy life before we're in the grave?" Rachel frowned, sensing the bite in her mother's words. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, she sat quietly at the kitchen table while her parents' argument flared again. "Dad just wants to make sure everyone's taken care of," Rachel said softly, trying to ease the tension. "That's not a bad thing, Mom." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Taken care of? He's so busy thinking about the church, about debts, about you kids, that he forgets about me. What about my life, Rachel? Don't I deserve anything?" Thomas lowered his eyes, ashamed. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I thought giving you my whole life was enough, Linda. I thought working myself to the bone, never asking for more, would prove my love." Rachel's heart sank. She had never heard her father sound so defeated. In that moment, she saw not just a tired steelworker, but a man losing the woman he had built his world around. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Dad, don't give up. We'll figure this out." But Linda had already turned away, her arms crossed, her face hard as stone. When Rachel left the next morning, she hugged her father tightly, whispering, "Take care of yourself, Dad." She didn't say the same to her mother. For Thomas, the silence of the house after their departure was heavier than ever. He sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched brochures Linda had left out. The laughter of his grandchildren still rang faintly in his ears, a reminder of the life he wanted to preserve. But in his wife's eyes, he saw only hunger for more, a hunger he could never satisfy. And with that thought, a line had been crossed. The lottery, which should have been their blessing, had become the poison seeping into their marriage. It was no longer a ticket to freedom. It was a spark that would ignite betrayal, greed, and murder. The days after the win should have been the happiest of their lives. $900,000 was more money than either Thomas or Linda had ever dreamed of having. But instead of drawing them closer, the money had opened a chasm between them, one that grew wider with each passing week. Thomas clung to his sense of responsibility. He still rose at 5 every morning, still pulled on his steel-toed boots, and still drove to the plant. When his coworkers teased him, "Tom, you're a rich man now. What the hell are you doing here?" He simply shrugged. "Money doesn't change who I am," he'd say. "Work keeps me grounded." Linda saw it differently. To her, his refusal to quit felt like stubbornness, maybe even betrayal. What good was wealth if her husband insisted on living as though they were still scraping by? She wanted to shed their old life like a snake sheds its skin, to embrace a version of herself she believed had always been waiting just beyond reach. Their conversations, once soft and familiar, now sparked with tension. At night, Thomas would talk about fixing the roof or setting up a college fund for their grandchildren, while Linda flipped through glossy catalogs and travel brochures. One evening, she tossed a brochure across the table. On the cover was a sunlit villa in Tuscany. "Look at this, Thomas. Imagine us there, waking up to vineyards, sipping wine, walking through cobblestone streets. We could book it tomorrow." Thomas glanced at the picture and pushed it back toward her. "It's beautiful, sure, but it's not us, Linda. That money won't last forever if we throw it around like confetti. We have to think long-term." Her lips tightened. "Long-term? Thomas, you're nearly 60. How much long-term do you think we've got left?" The word struck him like a slap. He stared at her, his jaw working, but he said nothing. He didn't want to fight. He never did. But inside, something inside him twisted, an unease, a sense that his wife was slipping away into a world he no longer understood. The neighbors noticed the changes, too. Mrs. Callahan next door whispered to another church lady, "Linda's got a new coat every week, I swear. And jewelry. Have you seen the rings she's been flashing?" Meanwhile, Thomas still wore the same faded work shirts, his lunch pail dented from years of use. People began to wonder if the lottery had been more curse than blessing. Behind closed doors, Linda's resentment hardened. She began making small moves in secret. She transferred sums of money into an account Thomas didn't know about. She met with a lawyer, casually asking about what might happen if she and Thomas divorced, what portion of the winnings she would be entitled to. She even joked to a friend over coffee, "If Thomas weren't around, I'd finally have the life I deserve." The friend laughed uneasily, not realizing how serious Linda's eyes were when she said it. At home, the fights escalated. One night, Thomas confronted her after noticing charges on their account. "Linda, what's this about? Jewelry stores? Spa treatments? Thousands gone in a blink?" "We agreed to be careful." She turned on him, her voice sharp. "No, you decided to be careful. You decided to live like a pauper even when we're rich. I'm tired of being dragged down by your small dreams, Thomas." His voice broke, both angry and pleading. "Small dreams? Wanting to take care of our children, our home, our church, that's not small. That's what matters. What happened to you, Linda? When did money become more important than us?" For a moment, her eyes softened, and he thought he saw the woman he'd married. But then her face hardened again. "Maybe it's always been more important," she whispered. Thomas slumped back in his chair, stunned into silence. That night, he sat alone on the porch long after Linda had gone to bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the crickets. He felt a gnawing in his chest, not just of fear, but of grief. Grief for a marriage he sensed was crumbling, for the woman he loved but no longer recognized. But Linda wasn't grieving. She was plotting. The seed that had first sprouted the night she clutched the winning ticket had begun to grow, twisting its roots deep into her thoughts. Every time she looked at Thomas, she no longer saw her husband. She saw an obstacle. She began rehearsing lies in her head, testing them like lines in a play. "He's been feeling sick lately. He's got a bad heart. He works too hard." She told herself these things so often they began to sound true. as though she were preparing the world for a tragedy yet to happen. And Thomas, blind to the danger, kept trying to fix what was already beyond repair. One Sunday after church, he reached for her hand as they walked to the car. "We can still make this work, Linda. We don't have to let money come between us. I love you. That hasn't changed." She smiled faintly, letting him hold her hand, but her eyes were cold. "We'll see, Thomas. We'll see." Inside her heart, though, she'd already made her decision. If Thomas would not let her live the life she believed she deserved, then Thomas would have to be removed from the picture. The cracks in their foundation had widened into a canyon. And soon, Linda would take the next step, turning her fantasies into a deadly plan. The thought began as a whisper, so faint that Linda almost dismissed it. But once planted, it grew louder with every passing day, until it became the only thing she could hear. If Thomas stood in the way of the life she wanted, then Thomas had to be removed. At first, she hated herself for even thinking it. She told herself it was just frustration, the kind every wife feels at times. But as the weeks passed, and as Thomas continued to talk about paying debts and donating to the church, the whisper hardened into resolve. "He doesn't see it. He'll never see it. If I don't act, I'll die in this same house, trapped in his small dreams." Linda began to plan. She researched obsessively, quietly, cautiously. Late at night, while Thomas slept, she scrolled through her phone, searching painless poisons, natural causes, undetectable toxins. She learned about digitalis, about antifreeze, about sleeping pills ground into powder. She studied old cases, wives who had tried and failed, and noted their mistakes. She wouldn't fail. The first step was creating the story. Linda began planting seeds with their friends and neighbors. Over coffee with Mrs. Callahan, she sighed dramatically. "Thomas has been looking so tired lately. I worry about his heart. All those years at the plant, the stress, it's catching up to him." At church, she confided to Pastor Harris, tears welling in her eyes. "Pray for Thomas, Pastor. He doesn't like to admit it, but I can see he's not well." Even Thomas noticed her sudden fussing. One evening, as she hovered with a bottle of vitamins, urging him to take them, he chuckled softly. "Linda, you're acting like I'm some fragile old man. I'm fine." Her smile was tender but hollow. "You don't know how much I worry about you, Thomas. You mean everything to me." But those words, instead of comfort, were rehearsals for the lies she would one day tell the police. She also began to set the stage financially. Quiet transfers into her private account continued. She increased the life insurance policy, insisting to Thomas that it was just a precaution. "You never know what tomorrow brings," she had said sweetly, sliding the papers in front of him. He signed, trusting her as he always had. The night she brought home the antifreeze, her hands shook as she carried the plastic jug in from the garage. She hid it behind the cleaning supplies, her mind racing with justifications. It's only a matter of time before he works himself into a heart attack anyway. This way, it will look natural, quick, peaceful. Still, she hesitated. Weeks passed, her courage wavering. She oscillated between cold determination and waves of guilt. Some mornings she looked at Thomas, his lined face, his gentle eyes, and nearly broke down. He was not a cruel man. He had never hurt her. His only crime was being small in his vision, cautious to the point of suffocating. Yet in her eyes, that was enough to make him disposable. One night, as they sat watching television, Thomas turned to her with a smile. "Linda, you know, I've been thinking. Maybe we could take a small trip. Not Italy or anything fancy. Maybe just the lake house for a week. Just us. Like old times." His sincerity nearly shattered her. For a moment, she wanted to say yes, to abandon her plan and choose love over greed. But then she thought of the brochures hidden under her dresser, the glittering jewelry she had tasted, the life just within reach. And the whisper returned, cold and insistent. "He is the obstacle. Remove him." So she did. Linda began slipping small amounts of antifreeze into Thomas's nightly drinks. Not enough to be obvious. Just a few drops in his sweet tea, a spoonful stirred into his wine. At first, he only complained of fatigue, of stomach aches. She clucked her tongue and insisted he see a doctor, playing the role of worried wife. "It's nothing, Linda," he reassured her one evening, clutching his side. "Probably just indigestion. You worry too much." Her heart pounded as she poured him another glass. "Here, drink this," she urged. "You'll feel better." The poison worked slowly, wearing him down. He grew pale, thinner. He coughed at night, sometimes struggled to catch his breath. Linda called her daughter one afternoon, feigning despair. "Your father's not well. I think something serious is wrong. I'm so scared." By then, the story was set. If anyone asked, Thomas was simply a man in decline, worn down by years of labor and hidden illness. But Linda's plan was not perfect. Thomas, though weakened, was still sharp enough to notice inconsistencies. One evening, after another bout of nausea, he looked at his half-empty glass and then at her. His voice was quiet, almost broken. "Linda, you're not... You wouldn't," he trailed off, unable to voice the thought, unable to imagine his wife could mean him harm. She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. For a moment, she thought he saw everything. But then he shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind. I'm just tired. Maybe I'm imagining things." He kissed her hand, his faith unshaken, and that faith sealed his fate. The final night came on a bitter January evening. Snow piled high against the windows, and the house felt like a tomb. Linda handed Thomas his glass of wine, smiling gently as he took it. They talked for a while, about their children, about the weather, about small things that had once filled their quiet life. Then, mid-sentence, his face contorted in pain. He clutched his chest, gasping. "Linda, help," he choked, collapsing to the floor. She knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his back, her voice rising in practiced panic. "Thomas. Oh God, Thomas, stay with me." She waited just long enough. Then, finally, she picked up the phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking with what sounded like terror. "My husband. Please, he's not breathing. Please hurry." By the time paramedics arrived, Thomas was gone. They tried resuscitation, but it was too late. Linda wept in their presence, clutching his hand, rocking back and forth. "He's been sick," she told them between sobs. "I knew it was coming. I knew it." The neighbors whispered condolences. The pastor prayed over the body, and Linda played the role to perfection, the grieving widow who had lost her hard-working husband too soon. But beneath the tears, her heart was steady. She had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The ticket that once promised hope had instead purchased death. What she did not know, what she could not have predicted, was that the cracks in her story were already showing. And soon, the truth would rise from the shadows, dragging her down with it. The night Thomas Miller collapsed, the house was filled with the frantic echo of Linda's screams. Neighbors later told investigators they could hear her sobbing through the thin winter air, calling out her husband's name, begging him to stay alive. By the time the paramedics arrived, snow crunching under their boots, Thomas lay motionless on the living room floor, his skin pale, his lips faintly blue. They tried everything: CPR, defibrillation, oxygen, but within minutes, the lead medic shook his head grimly. Time of death, 10:42 p.m. Linda fell against the couch, weeping into her hands. I told him he wasn't well. I knew this was coming," she cried, her voice hoarse with practiced despair. To the neighbors who gathered outside as the ambulance pulled away, it looked like the tragic but predictable end of a man worn down by decades of hard labor. The official cause of death, at least at first glance, seemed obvious: heart failure. He was almost 60, after all, and his wife had been telling everyone for weeks that his health was failing. Few questioned it. In fact, many nodded sadly, whispering, "Poor Linda. She saw it coming." But Detective Mark Henderson, called in as routine for an unattended death, wasn't entirely satisfied. Something about the scene felt too neat. He walked slowly through the small home, noticing details. A half-finished glass of wine on the coffee table, the faint scent of chemicals lingering in the air, the way Linda's eyes darted a little too quickly when he asked simple questions. "Mrs. Miller," Henderson said gently, notebook in hand. "When was the last time you saw your husband acting normal?" She dabbed at her tears with a tissue. "He hasn't been normal for weeks, Detective. He was tired, pale. I begged him to see a doctor. He wouldn't listen. And tonight?" Henderson pressed. Linda sniffled. "We were watching TV. He just collapsed. One minute he was talking about the weather, the next he was on the floor. I tried everything." Her voice cracked as she buried her face in her hands. It was convincing, almost too convincing. Henderson, a veteran of 2 decades, had seen many grieving widows, but rarely had he seen one so quick to repeat the same rehearsed lines. The medical examiner's preliminary report listed cardiac arrest as the probable cause, but Henderson requested a toxicology screen, just to be thorough. It was a decision that would unravel everything. Henderson closed his notebook, but something about the Miller house refused to sit right with him. He lingered in the living room, letting his eyes roam across the details most would overlook. The glass of wine on the coffee table was only half drunk, yet a faint crystalline residue clung to the bottom. He bent closer, frowning. "Funny thing," he muttered to himself, then turned to Linda. "Did your husband usually leave his drink unfinished?" Linda's hands twisted the tissue in her lap. He wasn't feeling well. He said it tasted off. Maybe the bottle was bad." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "And you still poured him another glass?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She forced a brittle laugh. Thomas was stubborn. He always wanted to finish what he started, even when he shouldn't. Henderson wrote something in his notebook, the scratch of his pen deliberate. He had interviewed enough grieving widows to recognize when answers came too quickly, too rehearsed. Later, as he walked out to his car, he spotted the recycling bin near the garage. Among the bottles and cans was an empty jug of antifreeze, its cap still slick with residue. Henderson stood there a long moment, the winter air biting his face. Back inside, he asked casually, "Mind if I take a quick look in the garage, Mrs. Miller?" Her smile froze. "Why? What for?" "Routine," he replied simply, though his eyes never left hers. The garage was neat, almost too neat, but the shelf of cleaning supplies drew his attention. Henderson noticed the faint ring of liquid dried around the spot where the antifreeze jug had been sitting. He crouched, running his finger along it, then wiped the sticky trace onto a handkerchief. When he turned back, Linda was standing stiffly in the doorway. "Detective," she said sharply, "is all this really necessary? My husband just died, and you're treating me like a suspect." Henderson straightened slowly, folding the handkerchief into his pocket. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I haven't called you a suspect, Mrs. Miller. Not yet. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. As Henderson drove away that night, the snow swirling across the windshield, he knew in his gut, Thomas Miller had not died by chance. Something darker was at play, and Linda was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Linda played her role with perfection. She wore black, accepted casseroles from sympathetic neighbors, and clutched her children tightly at the funeral, her tears streaming as the pastor spoke of Thomas's hard work, his faith, and his devotion to family. She stood by the casket, whispering, "I'll miss you forever," as mourners passed. To everyone present, she was the picture of grief. But cracks soon began to show. A week after the funeral, Henderson returned to the Miller home with more questions. "Mrs. Miller, your husband's co-workers say he never mentioned feeling ill. In fact, they said he was as steady as ever. Why do you think he never told anyone else he wasn't feeling well?" Linda stiffened, her smile faltering. "Because Thomas was stubborn. He never admitted weakness. He'd rather die than complain." "Funny," Henderson replied, closing his notebook. That's exactly what his coworkers said. Almost word for word. The toxicology report came back 2 days later. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze, detectable levels coursing through Thomas's blood. Henderson's suspicions hardened into certainty. Thomas Miller hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been poisoned. When Henderson confronted Linda with the findings, her reaction was theatrical. She gasped, clutched her chest, and whispered, "Poison? No, that can't be. Who would do such a thing?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Henderson said calmly, watching her closely. "Thing is, antifreeze poisoning doesn't happen by accident. Someone put it in his system. And from what we can tell, it was happening over time." Her eyes darted to the floor, then back to him. "You think I did it, don't you?" she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "I didn't say that," Henderson replied evenly. "But I do have more questions. For example, why did you take out a new life insurance policy just months before your husband's death?" Her face drained of color. She stammered, That was just a precaution. Thomas insisted on it. He wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of." But Henderson had already spoken to the insurance agent. It was Linda who had pushed for the policy, insisting, in fact, that Thomas sign immediately. Over the next week, more evidence surfaced. Bank records revealed Linda had been moving money into a private account. A neighbor recalled overhearing her say, "If Thomas died, I'd finally get to live." And the search of her internet history was damning. Late-night searches about poisons, symptoms of antifreeze ingestion, and how to make a death look natural. The evidence began to weave a picture darker than anyone had imagined. But perhaps the most haunting piece came from Thomas himself. In his wallet, folded neatly, was a note he had scrawled just days before his death. It read simply, "Linda is acting strange. If anything happens to me, someone should look closer." When Henderson showed the note to Thomas's daughter, she broke down sobbing. "He knew," she whispered. Oh God, he knew. Linda's arrest came on a gray February morning. Officers arrived at the house, where she answered the door in her robe, feigning surprise. "What is this? What's going on?" "Linda Miller," Henderson said firmly. "You're under arrest for the murder of your husband, Thomas Miller." The neighbors watched from their porches as she was led away in handcuffs, her face twisted in rage and disbelief. "I didn't do this. I loved him." "You're making a mistake," she screamed, though no one believed her anymore. Back at the station, confronted with the mountain of evidence, Linda tried every tactic: denial, tears, anger, even silence. But the truth was undeniable. The jury would see it. The world would see it. And in the end, the very fortune that was supposed to save her from mediocrity had sealed her fate. The ticket that promised freedom had become the rope that dragged her into the abyss. The courtroom was silent as Linda Miller was led in, shackled at the wrists, her once polished hair now graying and unkempt. Gone was the widow dressed in black who had played the grieving wife. In her place stood a woman hardened by weeks in custody, her eyes sharp, her lips pressed thin. Yet even now, she tried to hold on to the image of victimhood. Family, friends, and neighbors filled the wooden benches. Some came for closure, others out of morbid curiosity. At the front sat Thomas's daughter and son, their faces pale, their grief still raw. They had buried their father only weeks earlier, and now they faced the unthinkable truth. The woman who raised them had been the architect of his death. The prosecutor wasted no time painting the picture. "This was not the act of a desperate woman," he said, pacing before the jury. "It was the act of a greedy one. $900,000. That was the price she put on her husband's life. And she executed her plan with calculation, deceit, and cold-blooded determination." He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The internet searches, the secret bank transfers, the neighbors' testimonies, the insurance policy Linda had pushed through. And then came the toxicology report, the undeniable proof that antifreeze had slowly eaten away at Thomas's body until it killed him. When the prosecutor held up the note Thomas had written, "Linda is acting strange. If anything happens to me, someone should look closer." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. His children wept openly. The defense tried to paint a different story. Linda's attorney argued that she was overwhelmed, that she searched for poisons out of paranoia, not malice. He suggested Thomas could have ingested the antifreeze by accident, mistaking it for another substance in the garage. But the jury wasn't buying it. Too many threads tied back to Linda, and each one pointed to murder. Just when the defense seemed to be clawing for air, the prosecutor called one final witness, Mrs. Callahan, the Millers' longtime neighbor. The frail woman walked slowly to the stand, clutching her handbag like a shield. Under oath, her voice trembled but carried through the courtroom. A few weeks before Thomas passed, Linda came over for coffee. She looked right at me and said, "If Thomas weren't around, I'd finally get to live the way I want." I thought she was joking. I even laughed. But she didn't. Her eyes were cold. Gasps filled the gallery. Linda's head snapped up, her face flushing crimson. "She's lying," she shouted suddenly, breaking decorum. "That old woman's lying." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Miller, control yourself." But the damage was done. The jurors leaned forward, their faces tightening as they absorbed the weight of the testimony. The prosecutor seized the moment. He stepped to the center of the courtroom, his voice steady, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've just heard it from a neighbor who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming here today." Combine her words with the internet searches, the secret accounts, the insurance policy, and the poison itself, and what picture do you see? He let the silence hang before delivering the blow. You see a woman who valued $900,000 more than 30 years of marriage. You see a woman who chose greed over love, calculation over compassion. And you see a husband who left behind one final plea. Look closer. The prosecutor held up the handwritten note again, his voice tightening with passion. Thomas Miller tried to warn us. Tonight, his voice speaks through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every tear shed by his children. Do not let that voice be silenced. Hold his killer accountable. Linda sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. For the first time, her mask cracked, and the jury saw not a grieving widow but a woman cornered by truth. During her testimony, Linda wept, clutching the tissue in her hands. "I loved my husband," she insisted. "We had our problems, sure, but I never wanted him gone. I would never hurt Thomas. You have to believe me." But her words rang hollow. Her children refused to meet her eyes. The jurors watched her with expressions of cold disbelief. Detective Henderson testified with quiet authority. "I've seen many deaths in my career, but this one struck me. The scene was too polished, too rehearsed. And when the science came back, it confirmed what my instincts already told me. This was murder, not misfortune." After 2 weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. They deliberated for only 4 hours before filing back into the courtroom. The foreman, a solemn man in his 60s, stood and delivered the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Linda Miller, guilty of first-degree murder." A muffled cry escaped Linda's lips. She shook her head violently. No, I didn't do it. They're lying." But the judge's gavel struck sharply, silencing her protests. When the sentence was read, life in prison without the possibility of parole, the courtroom erupted. Some sighed in relief. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Thomas's children clung to each other, tears streaming down their cheeks. Justice, though painful, had finally been served. In the weeks that followed, the story dominated local headlines. Reporters dubbed it the lottery curse, pointing out how sudden wealth had transformed a working-class couple's life into a nightmare. Talk radio shows debated endlessly. Was Linda always this way, or had greed corrupted her? Could money really drive someone to kill the very person who had shared their life for over 3 decades? At the diner on Main Street, where Thomas used to stop for black coffee before work, the regulars gathered in hushed tones. Old men in flannel shirts shook their heads, muttering that they had never trusted Linda's fancy new coats and sudden airs. One leaned across the counter and said, $900,000, and she thought it was worth more than his life. That tells you everything about the world these days. At church, Pastor Harris delivered a sermon that struck the congregation to its core. "Beware the poison of greed," he said, his voice carrying through the pews. "For it can corrupt even the vows we make before God." Thomas Miller believed in love that endured, but Linda Miller allowed money to become her master. Parishioners wiped tears from their eyes, some remembering how Linda had once asked them to pray for Thomas's health. The local paper ran editorials debating whether sudden wealth should be considered a public hazard. "Lottery windfalls often destroy families instead of saving them," one columnist wrote. The Millers are only the latest example. Perhaps we should stop celebrating the lottery as fortune and start recognizing it as temptation. On the radio, callers argued fiercely. Some said Linda must have always been selfish, that money only unmasked the truth. Others claimed desperation could twist anyone. She wasted her whole life feeling small. One woman's voice cracked over the air. When she finally saw a way out, she took it. Doesn't excuse her, but it explains her. For Thomas's children, these debates were a cruel echo of their private grief. In interviews, his daughter Rachel said, "People can analyze all they want. To us, it's simple. Dad loved Mom, and she killed him for money. That's the truth we have to live with." Even months later, the Miller house stood as a grim reminder. The porch swing where Thomas once sat was motionless, the paint peeling, weeds growing high. Tourists sometimes drove by just to point and whisper, calling it the Lottery House. For the town, it became both a warning and a legend, a story to retell whenever someone bought a ticket and dreamed too big. For the townspeople, the case became a cautionary tale. In diners and church halls, people shook their heads and murmured, "If money can do that to a marriage like theirs, what hope is there for the rest of us?" Detective Henderson, when asked later about the case, put it bluntly, "Money doesn't change who you are. It just shows who you've been all along." And in Linda Miller's case, it showed someone willing to trade love, loyalty, and family for a bank account. At the old Miller house, the porch where Thomas once sat with his morning coffee stood empty. The rusted pickup still sat in the driveway, a silent reminder of the man who never wanted much more than the life he had. His children eventually sold the home, unable to bear the memories. The lottery winnings, frozen during the trial, were eventually divided, some to the children, some seized by the state to cover legal costs. None of it brought comfort. As Thomas's daughter said in a quiet interview, that money was never a blessing. It was a curse from the very start. And so, the story of Thomas and Linda Miller ended not in wealth and happiness, but in betrayal and ruin. He had dreamed of using the winnings to ease burdens, to leave a legacy of kindness. She had dreamed of escape, of luxury, of freedom at any cost. In the end, Thomas found peace only in death, while Linda's freedom became a cold cell where she would spend the rest of her life haunted by the man she once vowed to love. Months later, while sorting through their father's belongings, Rachel and her brother discovered an envelope tucked inside the drawer of his nightstand. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his, "For my family." Inside was a letter, written in Thomas's steady, deliberate script. "If you're reading this, then I suppose I didn't get the chance to say everything I wanted. I know life hasn't always been easy, but I never once regretted the path we walked together. The money we won, I only ever saw it as a way to lighten your burdens, to give you all a little more peace than I had. If I could ask anything of you, it's this: don't let money divide you. Don't let it blind you to what truly matters. Love each other. Take care of each other. That's the only fortune worth having." Rachel's hands trembled as she read the words aloud. Her brother turned away, unable to hide his tears. The simple letter, written with no knowledge of the betrayal that awaited him, felt like a final testament to the man Thomas truly was: humble, loyal, and devoted to his family until the end. They placed the letter back into the envelope and agreed to keep it safe, not as evidence, not as a reminder of the tragedy, but as a piece of their father's legacy. In the quiet of that moment, they realized that though Linda had destroyed his life, she could never destroy his love. That love lingered in his words, in their memories, and in the lives of his grandchildren who still remembered the way he lifted them onto his shoulders, laughing despite his tired bones. And so, while Linda's days stretched endlessly within prison walls, Thomas's presence lived on, gentle, steady, eternal. For everyone who knew him, the true lesson of the Miller story wasn't about the curse of the lottery. It was about the priceless worth of a faithful heart. In the months that followed, the Miller case continued to ripple far beyond the small town. National newspapers ran features under headlines like "The Dark Side of the American Dream" and "When Fortune Turns Fatal." Scholars weighed in on talk shows, debating whether sudden wealth should be considered a form of trauma. Money doesn't just change your circumstances, one professor argued. It changes how people see themselves and how they see the ones closest to them. The Miller case is proof that the human heart isn't always built to handle windfalls. Not everyone agreed. Call-in radio lines buzzed with heated voices. Some callers said Linda was simply evil, a selfish woman who would have betrayed her husband with or without the money. Others confessed uneasily that they, too, had fantasized about what they would do if fortune suddenly struck. Anyone who says they wouldn't be tempted is lying to themselves, one man admitted. At the local level, the story became folklore. Parents told it to their children as a cautionary tale. Don't let greed take root in your heart. Pastors wove it into sermons about sin and temptation. Even the State Lottery Commission quietly updated its counseling resources for big winners, as if trying to ward off the shadow of the Miller tragedy. And yet, no matter how much analysis or moralizing followed, the essential truth remained hauntingly simple. Thomas had trusted, and Linda had betrayed. In diners, in church basements, in barbershops, the debate still lingered. Was Linda Miller a victim of sudden wealth, or was she always destined to reveal her true self? The question had no easy answer. But for the people who knew Thomas, for the children who carried his memory, there was no debate at all. They remembered a man who found joy in small things, who saw enough in a simple life. And they remembered that, in the end, it was not the lottery that defined him, nor the crime that destroyed him, but the love he carried quietly, faithfully, until his final breath.